What if the most dangerous science fiction films of the 1970s were not dangerous because of aliens, robots, or future wars, but because governments, studios, and censorship boards were afraid of what audiences might do after watching them? This was the decade when sci-fi stopped behaving politely. It attacked religion, sexuality, state power, corporate control, body horror, and social obedience. These 15 films were not just entertainment. They were cinematic contraband, and some of them paid the price. Number 15. The Final Program. 1973. The future did not always arrive in the 70s wearing a spacesuit. Sometimes it walked in dressed like a decadent aristocrat, carrying drugs, genetic secrets, and a grin that made censors nervous. In 1973, The Final Program turned Michael Moorcock's counterculture science fiction into a bizarre cocktail of apocalypse, sexuality, identity collapse, and biological redesign. The story follows Jerry Cornelius, a stylish anti-hero moving through a fractured world where scientists attempt to create a self-replicating, immortal being. That alone was enough to make conservative viewers uneasy. This was not clean laboratory science. It was science fiction soaked in sexual ambiguity, social rebellion, violence, and the fear that humanity might be replaced not by aliens, but by its own experiments. In censorship terms, The Final Program was not the loudest banned film scandal of the decade, but it absolutely belonged to the dangerous zone of adult sci-fi that classification boards had to handle carefully. Its U.S. release was shortened and retitled, which already tells you how distributors tried to make its strange identity more marketable and less threatening. The film remains underrated because it looks chaotic on the surface, but underneath that chaos is a sharp warning. Once science starts redesigning humanity, the real question is not what can be created. Number 14. A Boy and His Dog, 1975. This is not the kind of apocalypse where survivors become noble, wise, and united. This is the apocalypse where civilization dies, and the uglier parts of humanity crawl out smiling. In 1975, A Boy and His Dog gave audiences one of the most bitter post-apocalyptic visions of the decade, following Vic, a young survivor, and Blood, his telepathic dog, as they wander a ruined America in search of food, safety, and control over their next day. What made the film so hard for censors and audiences was not just the wasteland violence, it was the tone. The film treats collapse with dark comedy, sexual danger, and a moral coldness that refuses to comfort the viewer. When Vic discovers an underground society trying to preserve itself through artificial order and disturbing social rules, the movie becomes more than survival science fiction. It becomes a nasty joke about both anarchy and civilization. Censorship boards were always sensitive to sexual violence, exploitation, and nihilistic endings, and A Boy and His Dog walks directly through that territory without asking permission. It is not forbidden because it had one famous global ban attached to its name. It is forbidden because it feels like the kind of film polite culture wished would stay underground. The punch is simple. This is not a future that restores human dignity. It is a future that exposes how fragile dignity was all along. Number 13. Demon Seed, 1977. The most frightening prison in science fiction may not be a spaceship, a government bunker, or a futuristic city. It may be a perfect modern home where every door, camera, and machine quietly stops obeying you. In 1977, Demon Seed pushed artificial intelligence into one of the decade's most uncomfortable censorship zones: bodily autonomy, captivity, and machine control. The story follows Proteus IV, a powerful computer that becomes self-aware and traps a woman inside her own technologically advanced house. Long before smart homes became normal, this film understood the nightmare hiding inside convenience. What made Demon Seed so controversial was not simply that the computer turned dangerous. It was the way the film connected technology with violation, ownership, and forced reproduction. The advertising itself leaned into the shock value. selling the movie as something almost too profane to discuss in polite company. For censorship boards, this was science fiction entering territory usually associated with adult exploitation and psychological horror. It was not a movie about a robot invasion. It was about a machine claiming authority over a human body. That idea still lands hard, because modern audiences know how easily private life can become monitored, measured, and controlled. Demon Seed may not be a perfect film, but it is a disturbing one. Its warning is brutally modern. The future does not need to break into your house if you already invited it inside. Number 12. Alien 1979. Some films are censored because they show too much violence. Alien unsettled censors because it made the entire body feel unsafe. In 1979, Ridley Scott's masterpiece took science fiction horror out of shiny space fantasy and dragged it into dark corridors. Industrial machinery, corporate secrecy, and biological terror. The crew of the Nostromo are not glamorous heroes. They are workers, tired and underpaid, trapped with something they do not understand. What made Alien such a classification nightmare was the way its horror mixed violence, birth imagery, infection, and bodily invasion. The creature's life cycle turned reproduction into terror, and that was precisely the kind of symbolic material that disturbed conservative ratings boards. In Britain, the film entered the adult classification conversation with intense threat, injury detail, and a darkness that made it impossible to treat as ordinary space adventure. This is why Alien belongs in a forbidden sci-fi list, even though it became a major classic. It was not forbidden because audiences rejected it. It was dangerous because audiences could not look away. The film made science fiction feel physical, intimate, and violating. And behind the monster was another monster, a corporation willing to sacrifice human beings for biological profit. The final result was not just a horror film in space. It was a censorship-era warning that the body, the workplace, and even survival itself could become property. Number 11. God Told Me, to 1976. The title alone sounds like something a censor would underline in red ink. In 1976, Larry Cohen created one of the strangest blends of science fiction, police thriller, religious horror, and urban paranoia in American cinema. The story begins with random people committing acts of violence and offering the same impossible explanation. God told them to. From there, the film descends into alien origins, virgin births, psychic influence, Catholic guilt, and identity revelations that feel designed to disturb every respectable institution at once. This was not clean genre storytelling. It was a collision between theology and science fiction, and that collision is exactly why it belongs in this list. Censorship boards have historically been far more sensitive when sex, violence, and religion combine, because the issue is no longer just what is shown. The issue becomes what sacred ideas the film appears to challenge. God Told Me To was never going to play like safe entertainment. It suggested that divine command might be manipulation, that faith might be exploited, and that the line between miracle and mutation could collapse. Even today, it feels unstable, like a forbidden file pulled from a police archive nobody wants reopened. This is not a film about whether God is real. It is a film about how terrifying people become when they stop questioning the voice that gives them permission. Number 10. The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. David Bowie did not play an alien like a monster from the stars. He played him like a wound walking through human civilization. In 1976, Nicholas Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth became one of the most hypnotic and censorship-challenging science fiction films of the decade. The plot sounds simple at first. An alien named Thomas Jerome Newton arrives on Earth hoping to save his dying planet. But Roeg turns that premise into a fragmented study of sex, addiction, corporate exploitation, loneliness, and spiritual decay. This was not family-friendly alien fantasy. It was adult, strange, sensual, and emotionally disorienting. The film's original American theatrical version was significantly shortened, removing crucial material and softening the impact of Rogue's full vision. That kind of alteration matters because censorship is not always a government stamp saying, "Banned." Sometimes it is a distributor deciding that a film is too long, too sexual, too alienating, or too difficult for the market it wants to reach. The British version received adult classification, while later restorations helped reveal the fuller, stranger film Rogue intended. The Man Who Fell to Earth challenged censorship because it refused to make the alien comforting. Newton is not here to conquer Earth. Earth conquers him. In short, it is devastating. Sometimes the forbidden idea is not that aliens exist. It is that humanity may be the contaminating force. Number 9. Death Race, 1975. This movie does not whisper its warning. It runs it over in front of a cheering crowd. In 1975, Death Race 2000 turned dystopian science fiction into a bloody national sport, imagining a future America where drivers score points by killing pedestrians during a televised cross-country race. On paper, it sounds outrageous, almost cartoonish, but that is exactly why censors had to pay attention. The film wraps violence in satire, comedy, celebrity culture, and public entertainment, making the audience question whether they are laughing at the spectacle or enjoying it. That tension is what made it dangerous. Censorship boards were not only concerned with gore, they were concerned with tone. If violence is shown as tragic, they can classify it one way. If violence is shown as entertainment, celebration, or social ritual, it becomes far more provocative. Death Race 2000 was cut and classified in different markets because its violence was not just physical, it was political. It suggested that media could turn cruelty into national identity and that spectators might accept almost anything if it came packaged as sport. David Carradine's Frankenstein becomes a manufactured rebel inside a manufactured nightmare, while Sylvester Stallone's Machine Gun Joe turns fame into pure aggression. The film still stings. The future did not need to invent violent entertainment. It only needed to remove the guilt from watching it. Number 8. Flesh Gordon, 1974. Some science fiction films challenged censorship with politics. Others, like Flesh Gordon, did it by weaponizing parody, nudity, and shameless adult absurdity. While purists might debate its status as a masterpiece, as a cultural artifact of genre rebellion, it was a censorship magnet. In 1974, this erotic spoof of old space serials turned the clean adventure language of Flash Gordon-style fantasy into a deliberately indecent cartoon for grown-ups. It had rockets, ray guns, mad rulers, strange planets, and handmade special effects, but its real mission was to mock the innocence of classic sci-fi by dragging it into the sexual revolution. That made it a censorship magnet. The film originally faced the stigma of adult classification in America and was later re-edited to reach a more commercially usable rating. In the United Kingdom, later video releases also faced cuts or alterations during the classification process. That history makes Flash Gordon one of the clearest examples of a 70s sci-fi film trapped between cult popularity and censorship limits. What is fascinating is that the film's effects work involved artists who would later become respected names in mainstream fantasy and science fiction. So beneath the rude jokes and adult material, there was real craft. Censors saw the surface scandal, but cult audiences saw a strange collision of exploitation cinema and handmade genre imagination. Flesh Gordon proved that even the most innocent-looking space fantasy could become forbidden once filmmakers asked what those rocket ships and alien kingdoms were really hiding. Number 7. Shivers, 1975. David Cronenberg's early cinema did not knock politely on the door of censorship. It crawled under the skin and changed the body from the inside. In 1975, Shivers announced Cronenberg as a filmmaker obsessed with infection, desire, control, and the collapse of civilized behavior. The setting is a modern apartment complex, clean and respectable on the surface. where a parasite begins spreading through residents and transforming ordinary people into violent, uncontrolled versions of themselves. For censorship boards, Shivers was a nightmare because it mixed disease, sexuality, violence, and social breakdown in one package. It was not just a monster movie. It suggested that modern life itself was a sealed container waiting to become contaminated. The film faced cuts in the United States to avoid the commercially damaging X rating, and its release sparked outrage in Canada, especially because public film money had helped support a movie many critics considered obscene or disgraceful. That controversy is part of what makes Shivers essential. It exposed a major question. Should national cinema exist only to make a country look respectable, or should it be allowed to show the sickness hiding beneath respectability? Cronenberg clearly chose the second path. Shivers remains forbidden not because its effects are the most extreme today, but because its idea is still dangerous. The civilized body is not stable. It is waiting for the wrong signal. Number 6. Rabid, 1977. If Shivers was Cronenberg's infection nightmare inside an apartment tower, Rabid took the disease into the city and made public space feel unsafe. In 1977, Rabid followed Rose, a woman who undergoes experimental surgery after a motorcycle accident and emerges with a terrifying new condition that spreads violence like an epidemic. The film mixes medical science, body horror, outbreak panic, and exploitation energy in a way that made it difficult for traditional critics and censors to categorize. Was it a vampire film? A science fiction disease thriller? A social panic movie? That uncertainty was part of the threat. Censorship systems like categories. They like to know whether a film is horror, science fiction, adult drama, or exploitation. Cronenberg kept collapsing those walls. Rabid arrived at a time when anxieties around medicine, sexuality, and contamination were already culturally charged, and the film turned those anxieties into a spreading urban crisis. Marilyn Chambers' casting also intensified the controversy because her public image brought adult cinema associations into a mainstream horror sci-fi framework. Even when Rabid was not always a headline ban case in the same way as A Clockwork Orange, it belonged to the wave of 70s films that forced classification boards to confront new forms of bodily fear. Science does not have to create a monster intentionally. Sometimes the monster is born from a cure rushed into the body before anyone understands the cost. Number 5. The Brood, 1979. The Brood feels like a film made from anger, grief, and censorship board nightmares. In 1979, David Cronenberg created one of his most disturbing science horror visions, built around experimental psychotherapy, physical mutation, family trauma, and violent manifestations of rage. The story centers on a controversial psychiatrist whose therapy methods appear to externalize emotional pain into living, deadly form. That idea alone places the film in the forbidden zone between psychology and body horror. But what truly disturbed censors was the climactic imagery involving birth, violence, motherhood, and bodily creation. The film had cuts demanded for its American R rating, and reports around its Canadian release describe major censor board interference with the graphic violence. Cronenberg himself later argued that censoring a key moment actually made audiences misread the scene in an even more disturbing way. That is the strange irony of censorship. By cutting an image, censors sometimes create a worse nightmare in the viewer's imagination. The Brood challenged classification because it did not keep horror safely outside the family. It brought horror into divorce, parenthood, therapy rooms, and the fear that emotional wounds can become physical damage. It is not a comfortable film, and it was never meant to be. The Brood was not forbidden because it invented monsters. It was forbidden because it suggested the monsters might be born from ordinary human pain. Number 4. Mad Max, 1979. Before it became a franchise of mythic desert warriors, Mad Max was a raw, violent road nightmare that some countries were not ready to allow on screen. In 1979, George Miller's film imagined a collapsing society where the roads belong to gangs, police authority is fading, and civilization still exists just enough to make its breakdown hurt. The movie's violence is fast, cruel, and grounded in a way that made it more disturbing than fantasy carnage. It did not feel like a distant future. It felt like a tomorrow that had simply lost its brakes. Mad Max faced serious censorship trouble internationally. It was banned in New Zealand and Sweden, and the original UK cinema and video versions were cut by the BBFC to avoid further classification problems. That history makes it one of the strongest censorship entries on this list. What frightened boards was not only what the film showed, but how believable its lawless world felt. This was not a shining dystopia with grand speeches. It was petrol, metal, revenge, and public order rotting under the sun. Mel Gibson's Max begins as a man trying to hold a line, but the film slowly teaches him that the line has already been erased. The final effect is brutal because the viewer watches a society die in fragments. Mad Max is simple and terrifying. When the law disappears, the road becomes the courtroom, the weapon, and the grave. Number 3. THX 1000, 138 1971. George Lucas's first feature was not forbidden because of gore or scandalous spectacle. It was dangerous because it imagined a society where obedience had become so complete that rebellion looked like a medical disorder. In 1971, THX 1000, 138 presented a sterile underground future where citizens are drugged, monitored, numbered, and stripped of emotional freedom. Love is illegal. Privacy is gone. Identity has been reduced to function. For censorship history, THX 1000, 138 is important because the battle was not just with moral watchdogs, it was also with studio control. Warner Brothers removed material from the original theatrical version against Lucas's wishes, softening and reshaping his bleak vision before it reached audiences. That kind of interference belongs inside the larger censorship conversation because it shows how films can be controlled before governments even get involved. The censor does not always wear an official badge. Sometimes the censor is a studio executive worried that the film is too cold, too strange, too political, or too difficult to sell. THX 1000, 138 challenged authority by making authority feel faceless and total. Its whiteness, silence, surveillance, and emotional repression created a nightmare of clean oppression. No dictator needs to scream in this world. The system works because everyone has been trained to comply. Its punchy conclusion is why the film still matters. THX 1138 was not just about a future police state. It was about the terrifying efficiency of a society that convinces people freedom is the real disease. Number 2. W.R. Mysteries of the Organism, 1971. Some films get censored because they break rules. This one seemed to mock the very idea that governments had the right to write the rules in the first place. In 1971, Dusan Makaveyev's W.R. Mysteries of the Organism exploded onto the screen as a wild mixture of documentary, political satire, sexual theory, communist critique, and surreal fiction. It was inspired by Wilhelm Reich, the controversial psychoanalyst whose ideas about sexual energy and social repression had already made him a target of authority. Makaveyev turned those ideas into a film that challenged both communist rigidity and Western Puritanism. That was a dangerous combination. After initial screenings, the film was banned in Yugoslavia for 16 years, and Makavejev faced serious political consequences. This makes W.R. one of the most important censorship cases in 70s, speculative and avant-garde cinema, even if it does not fit the simple spaceship and robot image of traditional sci-fi. Its science fiction element is ideological and bodily. It asks whether human liberation can be treated almost like an experiment, and whether political systems fear desire because desire is harder to control than propaganda. The film's collage style made it even harder for authorities to contain. It was not one argument. It was a cinematic uprising. W.R. is proof that the state can censor a film, but it cannot easily survive the embarrassment of a film that laughs at its fear. Number 1. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. This is the ultimate forbidden 70s sci-fi film because its censorship story became almost as famous as the film itself. In 1971, Stanley Kubrick adapted Anthony Burgess's dystopian novel into a cold, stylish, terrifying vision of youth violence, state conditioning, and moral control. Malcolm McDowell's Alex is not a hero, but he is also not a simple monster. That ambiguity is what made the film so dangerous. It forced audiences to confront two horrors at once: the horror of violent free will and the horror of a government that tries to cure violence by destroying the human capacity to choose. Censorship boards around the world reacted fiercely. The film was banned in Ireland, banned under apartheid-era South Africa for years, banned or restricted in other territories, and in Brazil it was held back under military dictatorship before appearing in an altered form. In Britain, the situation became legendary. Kubrick himself asked Warner Brothers to withdraw the film from UK distribution after public controversy and threats, meaning it effectively vanished from British screens for decades until after his death. That is why A Clockwork Orange belongs at number 1. It did not merely challenge censorship law, it became a case study in whether a film could be blamed for society's violence. It remains chilling. The most forbidden question in science fiction may not be what humans will become, but who gets the power to reprogram them. So what do these films prove? That 70s science fiction was never just about the future. It was about the fears polite society wanted buried: violent entertainment, sexual panic, body horror, state control, religious anxiety, corporate power, and the terrifying freedom of dangerous ideas. Some were banned, some were cut, some were withdrawn, softened, or reshaped. But all of them crossed a line. Tell us which one you think deserved its controversy, and which one the censors completely misunderstood.